Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going somewhere quieter than a battlefield, but somehow just as demanding. A world of starched collars, percolating coffee, and a kind of exhaustion nobody in 1954 was allowed to call by its real name. We're spending a full day inside the life of an American housewife at the exact midpoint of the 20th century, back when a clean floor was a moral statement, and a wilted lettuce leaf could ruin your reputation on the block. If you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for one purpose: to help you drift off to sleep while your brain quietly absorbs some genuinely strange and genuinely true history. So dim the lights, let your shoulders drop and settle in. There's nothing urgent happening here except the past, unfolding slowly. Before we begin, a small ritual of our own. If you'd like to support the channel, a like or a subscription helps more than you'd think, though only if you're actually enjoying the trip. And if you're listening from somewhere far from home, or wide awake at some strange hour when the rest of the world is asleep, leave a comment and tell me where and when. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now, a few questions to carry with you into the story. Why did a spotless kitchen count as a wife's report card? Why was a woman expected to reapply her lipstick before her husband's car even turned onto the street? Why did an entire decade decide that a well-ironed pillowcase was a form of patriotism? And why, in a country that had just split the atom, was a housewife still expected to identify the correct way to fold a napkin? Let's find out. It's 5 in the morning in a quiet American suburb, and somewhere behind a set of gingham curtains, the day is already beginning. There is no alarm clock loud enough to compete with the internal one a 1950s housewife carries around in her chest. It goes off on its own, somewhere in the dark, well before the birds have committed to singing. She doesn't so much wake up as she reports for duty, sliding out from under the blankets with the practiced quiet of someone who has learned that the difference between a peaceful morning and total collapse is about 11 minutes of silence. Historians of the period sometimes point out that home economics courses of the era, the ones taught in high schools across the country, genuinely instructed young women that a well-run household ran on a strict, almost military schedule, with tasks assigned to specific days and specific hours. Monday for laundry, Tuesday for ironing. A woman who deviated from the schedule wasn't just disorganized. She was, in the language of the home economics textbooks of the time, letting her family down. So she moves through the dark house by memory. The hallway light stays off. Electricity is not a thing to be wasted on convenience, only on necessity. And she navigates around a scattered platoon of toy soldiers and a single abandoned roller skate with the sure-footedness of someone performing this exact walk for the 1000th time. In the kitchen, she flips the switch, and the room reveals itself. Countertops wiped down the night before, a refrigerator organized with an almost architectural precision, and a breakfast nook that, in about 40 minutes, will need to look like something out of a magazine advertisement, despite currently being empty, dim, and slightly chilly. The percolator goes on first. This is not simply about coffee. This is about survival infrastructure. The percolator, a genuinely new and exciting piece of post-war kitchen technology for many households, having become far more common and much cheaper after the war, gurgles and hisses its way through its cycle, filling the kitchen with a smell that will, in about 20 minutes, be the only thing keeping her upright. While it works, she begins on breakfast, and this is where the real performance starts. Eggs cracked one-handed, not because it's efficient, but because some unspoken rule of domestic competence demands it. Bacon in the pan, sizzling and spitting with the enthusiasm of something that knows it's about to ruin a clean apron. Toast in a toaster that, if it was built any time before 1955, runs on a spring mechanism just fussy enough to be genuinely unpredictable, popped too early, and the bread is pale and sad. Too late, and you've got a small kitchen fire and a very short list of people to blame. None of this food, by the way, is for her. She'll eat standing at the sink later, a cold crust in one hand, coffee in the other, in the 15 seconds of total household silence she'll get all day. This meal is for the family that will consume it in under 10 minutes and leave behind a level of destruction wildly disproportionate to the size of the meal itself. She sets the table with real care, plates squared, napkins folded into shapes she picked up from a magazine spread, the good silverware because, in this house, every breakfast is treated like a mild formal occasion. Then she allows herself a breath. Just one. A short, private moment of stillness before the house officially wakes and the performance moves from rehearsal to opening night. There's a final stop at the hallway mirror. Hair needs convincing. A little color pinched into the cheeks. The smile gets practiced, not a big smile, just something warm enough to suggest she spent the last hour drinking tea and reading poetry rather than wrestling bacon in a hot skillet at dawn. Historians studying the advertising and etiquette literature of the period have noted just how explicitly women were told that a cheerful appearance each morning was, in itself, a wifely duty. That fatigue, however real, was something to be privately managed rather than publicly shown. Then the footsteps begin. Small ones first, bare feet on a cold floor, already complaining about something. Then heavier ones. The house is waking up, blissfully unaware that an entire invisible workday has already taken place before anyone else so much as opened their eyes. By the time the family arrives, breakfast has to look effortless, as though eggs simply appeared, golden and fluffy, because the day itself was feeling generous. The truth, of course, is considerably less magical. The refrigerator, a genuinely prized possession in a 1950s household, and still, for many families, a fairly recent upgrade from the icebox, opens with a low mechanical groan. Inside, eggs bought at a price that would have made her mother wince, bacon on sale because its expiration date was suspiciously close, and milk that, depending on how warm the kitchen ran overnight, might be one bad morning away from becoming something entirely different. The cast iron skillet lands on the stovetop with a clang that could probably be heard 2 houses down. The burner catches with a small blue flare, and the eggs go in cracked with that practiced one-handed flourish, stirred with a small splash of milk. Because Good Housekeeping and similar publications of the era were fond of promising that this particular trick produced cloud-like, restaurant-quality eggs. Whether the food editors who wrote that advice had ever actually tested it under real morning conditions remains, historically speaking, an open question. The bacon, meanwhile, is doing what bacon does, hissing, spitting, launching the occasional grease droplet in her direction like it's taking this personally. She tilts the pan, half shield and half instinct, still smiling faintly, because even minor kitchen warfare must be conducted with composure. The toast is next, and the toaster, small, chrome, and running on a combination of springs, guesswork, and a small amount of hope, gets its 2 slices and a silent, low-stakes prayer. While everything cooks, the table gets its final choreography. Plates at careful angles, napkins folded with intention, utensils lined up like they're expecting inspection, because in a way they are. A woman's home was, by the standards of the era's advice columns and etiquette guides, a direct reflection of her character, and breakfast was the first test of the day. Orange juice gets poured from a heavy glass bottle, the kind that could double as a paperweight, foamy and fresh, because store-bought juice, while common enough by the mid-1950s, was somehow still meant to look like it had been squeezed that morning by hand, in a burst of homemade devotion nobody actually had time for. And then, the parade down the stairs. Husband first, sniffing the air with the easy confidence of a man who has never once wondered how the eggs got there. Children next, rubbing their eyes like small, overworked laborers who have, in fact, contributed nothing to this morning's operation. This is the most delicate moment of the whole performance. She has to greet them warmly, as though she herself just wandered in from a peaceful night's sleep, rather than having fought a small war with a cast iron skillet 20 minutes earlier. The food gets presented as though it assembled itself out of sheer respect for the family's effort in simply waking up. They eat, The kitchen goes quiet in that particular way that only happens when everyone is chewing at once. She finally gets her coffee, watching them from across the table, thinking, however briefly, I did it. I survived breakfast. And in 1954, that's not nothing. That's a small, unglamorous, thoroughly uncelebrated victory, repeated daily for years by millions of women whose names never made it into any history book. Once the plates are cleared, there's a second ceremony waiting, one just as scripted as breakfast, though it runs on a much tighter clock. It's the ritual of getting her husband out the door, and it has to be completed with total precision by roughly 10 past 8, or the entire remaining schedule for the day begins to slide sideways. It starts with the lunch pail steel, dented in one corner from some forgotten mishap, decorated with the kind of cheerful factory line imagery that 1950s manufacturers loved to stamp onto everyday objects. She hands it over like it matters, because in a strange way it does. Inside is a sandwich, an apple, and something she suspects he'll trade with a coworker before noon. Then comes the inspection. Not spoken, never spoken, but real all the same, a quick scan from collar to shoe. Tie straight. Jacket free of yesterday's evidence. Trousers clear of anything a small child might have left behind. She gives him a final once-over, a tug at the lapel, and a small nod of approval, as though she's just cleared him for active duty in a war whose only real casualties are punctuality and dry cleaning bills. There's an invisible checklist too: keys, wallet, the folded newspaper tucked under one arm like a badge of office. She asks if he wants his coat. He says no. She hands it to him anyway, because the man has never once correctly predicted Ohio Valley weather in April, and she isn't about to let a beautiful clear sky in his mind fool either of them. He checks his watch, because in this decade, a man checking his watch before leaving a room is practically a constitutional requirement. He clears his throat, adjusts his tie one more unnecessary time, and offers a few parting remarks about his schedule that day: a meeting, a client, something involving a colleague she'll hear about again at 6 o'clock whether she wants to or not. She listens, nods, makes the appropriate encouraging sounds. She does not mention the 3 loads of laundry currently competing for her attention, or the fact that the lawn, his stated responsibility, according to the invisible and entirely unwritten division of labor agreement they apparently signed at the altar, has not been touched in 9 days. One final sweep of the house before he's allowed to leave. The hallway table, the coat rack, the spot by the door where his briefcase inevitably waits, forgotten every single morning with the reliability of sunrise. She retrieves it, hands it over gently, as though passing along something fragile. And then finally, the door. He steps outside, takes a breath of morning air like a man auditioning for a life insurance advertisement, and offers a brisk goodbye. She reminds him once more about the coat. He waves it off. It will, without question, rain by early afternoon. She stands in the doorway and watches the car pull out of the driveway, offering one last wave. Not really for him, if she's honest, but for the neighborhood, because a woman standing in her doorway waving her husband off to work was, according to the era's own etiquette columns, a small daily performance of a happy, functioning marriage, whether or not that happiness required any particular effort behind closed doors. The moment the car turns the corner, she exhales. The house goes quiet. For roughly 4 seconds there is peace. Then she turns around, and the breakfast dishes are still exactly where she left them. Before any of the real work of the day can begin, there's a transformation to manage, because, according to virtually every women's magazine of the period, a housewife was not meant to clean her home in whatever was comfortable. She was meant to clean it while looking like she wasn't cleaning at all. Oh, she changes, not into something soft or forgiving, but into a fitted day dress, the kind with a waistline snug enough to make bending over feel like a genuine athletic risk. This is layered with an apron, crisp, patterned, decorated with cheerful little motifs like flowers or fruit, the sort of garment whose actual function, protecting clothing from spills, feels almost secondary to its real job, which is broadcasting effort and cheerfulness to anyone who happens to glance through the window. Then there's the hair pinned, curled, sprayed into a shape sturdy enough to survive several hours of humidity, at least one unexpected sneeze. And the general chaos of small children. This is not a quick process. It involves a comb, a generous application of setting spray, and a fair amount of quiet negotiation with a hairstyle that has its own ideas about how the day should go. And finally, for many women of a certain social standing in this era, a string of pearls, not because pearls are practical for scrubbing a stove, but because they signaled a particular kind of composure. Ladies' magazines of the time genuinely promoted the idea that a well-dressed woman doing housework in full at-home attire was simply performing her role correctly. The pearls stayed cool against her collarbone, a quiet reminder that even mid-scrub, she was expected to look like she belonged on the cover of a homemaking pamphlet. Fully assembled, dress, apron, hair, pearls, she catches her reflection in the hallway mirror, and for one honest second sees exactly what she is. A woman dressed for a cocktail party who is about to go elbow-deep in yesterday's grease. But there's no time to dwell on the absurdity of it. The living room carpet needs its lines. The dust has already begun its quiet, patient return. And somewhere in the linen closet, an enormous chrome vacuum cleaner is waiting, humming with quiet menace, for its daily appointment. In the hallway closet stands the vacuum cleaner, a heavy chrome-plated machine with the general silhouette of something built to survive a small war. It is not light. It is not agile. It moves less like a household appliance and more like a stubborn animal being walked somewhere it doesn't want to go. She wheels it out, cord already looping itself around her ankle with what feels like deliberate mischief, and plugs it in. It roars to life with an enthusiasm that seems disproportionate to the actual task of removing yesterday's crumbs from a rug that, realistically, no one has walked on since dinner. But cleanliness in 1954 is rarely just about cleanliness. Home economics literature of the period frequently framed a well-kept house as a direct, visible measure of a wife's devotion, carpet lines included. Those neat, parallel stripes left behind by a fresh pass of the vacuum weren't just tidy. They were a kind of signal, readable by any neighbor who happened to glance through the front window, confirming that this household was, in fact, still functioning at full capacity. So she pushes the machine forward in long, deliberate strokes, back and forth, turning the living room floor into something resembling a freshly mowed field. It's almost meditative if you can ignore the machine's tendency to overheat, emit a faint burning smell, and occasionally attempt to strangle a nearby table leg with its own cord. The children know better than to walk across a freshly vacuumed carpet, not because anyone has explicitly forbidden it, though someone probably has at some point, but because the social consequences of leaving a footprint in a just-finished carpet are somehow understood by even the youngest member of the household. The family dog, for the record, has no such understanding, and will cross that carpet with total indifference the moment the vacuum goes quiet. When it's finished, she steps back to survey her work, clean, symmetrical lines running the length of the room, evidence of order in a day that otherwise offers very little of it. She winds the cord carefully, because a tangled cord thrown haphazardly into a closet is, in the quiet moral universe of the 1950s home, its own small failure. Then the vacuum goes back into its closet, and the ritual is complete, at least until the dog decides otherwise. Dust in this era isn't treated as a natural byproduct of simply existing in a house. It's treated as evidence of neglect, evidence of a woman who has, in some small but visible way, let her standards slip. She begins with a feather duster, an object whose actual cleaning power is somewhere between negligible and purely symbolic, and works her way methodically around the room. The picture frames first, holding the frozen expressions of relatives who seem, in their sepia stillness, faintly disapproving of her technique. Then the small ceramic figurines, birds, dogs, the odd commemorative plate, each one lifted, dusted, and returned to its exact original position, because a shifted knickknack is somehow more noticeable than an unmoved layer of dust. The wooden television cabinet gets its own attention. Televisions were still, for a great many American families in the mid-1950s, a relatively new and genuinely prized piece of furniture. Ownership had climbed sharply over just a few years, and the set often occupied a place of honor in the living room, treated with the same reverence as a piano or a good sideboard. Naturally, it also collected dust and fingerprints with impressive efficiency, and she wipes the screen with the quiet, weary determination of someone who suspects the dust will be back within the hour. Bookshelves come next, their contents mostly serving a decorative rather than a literary function in many homes of the period, and she runs the duster along each spine, sending up a faint cloud that makes her cough softly. Ceiling fan blades, the top of the door frame, the upright piano nobody in the house actually plays but which everyone agrees looks respectable sitting there. By the time she finishes, the room is spotless, gleaming, briefly and improbably perfect. And then, because entropy has never once respected a clean coffee table, a single new speck of dust drifts down and lands directly in the center of it, as though the universe itself is reminding her that this particular battle has no actual ending. After the cleaning comes the dishes, and this, more than almost any other task of the day, becomes something closer to therapy than chore. The sink fills with hot water and a bloom of soap, and she works through a stack of plates, cups, and cutlery with a rhythm that, after enough repetition, requires almost no conscious thought at all. This leaves her mind free to wander, and it wanders in exactly the directions you'd expect. The laundry still waiting, the dinner menu not yet decided, a recipe a neighbor swore was foolproof, and which, last time, ended in a minor family rebellion. She scrubs a stubborn bit of egg from a plate with more focus than the task probably requires, half wondering if there's some deeper meaning in a stain that simply refuses to budge. Each clean plate goes into the drying rack with careful precision, angled just so, because an unevenly stacked dish rack registers, somewhere deep in her nervous system, as a tiny personal failure. The good silverware gets its own separate polishing, buffed until it catches the light properly, because in a decade obsessed with appearances, even a fork was expected to perform. By the time the last dish is dried and put away, her hands are pruned and a little raw, but her mind, oddly, feels clearer than it did an hour ago. No interruptions, no demands, just water, suds, and the quiet architecture of her own thoughts. It's not much of a break by any reasonable definition, but in 1954 it's close enough. There is no task in the 1950s household calendar quite as physically demanding, or as quietly judged as laundry. In many home economics guides of the era, the week was mapped out with almost religious specificity: Monday for washing, Tuesday for ironing, each day assigned its own labor like a liturgical calendar for domestic life. Fall out of step with that rhythm, and you weren't simply behind schedule. You were, in the unspoken moral arithmetic of the neighborhood, letting things slide. It begins with sorting, and sorting is not a casual activity. She kneels in front of the hamper, already overflowing, always overflowing, and separates its contents with real seriousness. Whites in one pile, colors in another. A small, hopeful pile of delicates, a category that in most households consisted of maybe 3 garments the family owned that hadn't already been ruined by an overly aggressive wash cycle. The socks present their own permanent mystery. Somehow, no matter how carefully she sorts, a portion of them arrive at the hamper without their matching partner, as though somewhere in the house there exists a small, thriving underground economy of single socks living their best lives, unaccountable to anyone. The washing machine itself, for households fortunate enough to own one by the mid-1950s, a genuine and still fairly recent luxury for a huge number of American families, is an imposing piece of machinery, mechanically loud in a way that modern ears would find genuinely alarming. She measures detergent with real care, because detergent in this period wasn't cheap, and a wasted scoop felt like a wasted afternoon. She lowers the lid, sets the dial, and steps back as the machine groans, fills, and begins its long, rattling cycle, sloshing water with enough enthusiasm that she keeps one eye on it the entire time, half expecting it to attempt an escape across the laundry room floor. While it works, she turns to the household's largest and least cooperative laundry item, the bedsheets, wrestling a full-sized fitted sheet into a washing machine and later back out again, soaked and impossibly heavy, requires a kind of upper-body effort that no etiquette manual of the period ever bothered to mention. At one point she gets briefly tangled in a damp sheet and considers, for a fleeting moment, simply living inside it and letting the rest of the household fend for itself. Eventually the wash cycle finishes with a final shudder, and she transfers everything, either to a dryer, still a genuine luxury item in many homes of this decade, or more often to a clothesline strung across the backyard. Hanging laundry outside was its own small performance. Items had to be pinned with real precision, evenly spaced, because a sloppy clothesline was, in the visual language of the suburban block, a mild public confession that the household inside wasn't running quite as smoothly as it should. She pins the sheets first, and they billow and snap in the wind like something with opinions of their own, occasionally smacking her directly in the face with wet cotton, as if to remind her who's really running this operation. Shirts, trousers, and socks follow, and there's a strange, genuine peace to it, sunlight on her back, the clean smell of detergent in the breeze, a brief and welcome pause from the noise of the house behind her. Once everything is dry, the basket comes back inside for folding, and folding, like everything else in this decade, is treated less as a chore and more as a small discipline. Towels stacked into identical rectangles, shirts folded into crisp, symmetrical shapes, sheets wrestled somehow into neat squares despite their clear preference for remaining a tangled mess. When the last item is folded and the stack sits perfectly aligned, she allows herself a short breath of satisfaction, knowing full well that the hamper, somewhere upstairs, is already quietly refilling. If laundry is a full-body workout, ironing is its more precise, more punishing cousin. Wrinkles in the visual and moral logic of 1950s domestic life were treated as small failures of character, and an ironing board set up in the middle of an afternoon was essentially a battlefield. The board itself, spring-loaded and a little unpredictable, unfolds with more force than seems strictly necessary, and she wrestles it into position the way you'd handle a large, slightly untrustworthy animal. The iron heats up beside it, hissing faintly, radiating heat with a kind of quiet menace that makes the whole kitchen a few degrees warmer within minutes. Her husband's dress shirts come first, and their wrinkles are stubborn in a way that feels almost personal. She lays each one flat with real focus, moving the iron in slow, deliberate passes, smoothing the fabric inch by careful inch. The collar demands special attention. It has to stand crisp and sharp, practically load-bearing, because a wilted collar on a man heading into an office was, by the standards of the day, a quiet reflection on his wife's competence rather than his own. The trousers follow, and here the goal is a crease sharp enough to be measured with a ruler, a small, precise line running the length of each leg, achieved through careful folding and firm, patient pressure. Pillowcases seem, at first glance, like they should be the easy part of the job. They are not. They slide, they fold unevenly. They resist the iron with a kind of quiet, fabric-based rebellion that seems designed specifically to test her patience at the exact moment she has the least of it left. By the time she's worked through the full pile, shirts, trousers, pillowcases, the occasional stubborn tablecloth, her arms ache. Her back has filed its own private complaint, and the kitchen smells faintly of hot cotton and steam. But the stack sitting beside the ironing board is genuinely impressive. Crisp, sharp-edged, ready for another week of quiet, unglamorous performance. She unplugs the iron, folds the board back into the closet with the same wary respect she gave it at the start, and glances at the clock. There's no time to admire the work for long. Somewhere in the kitchen, an entire week of meals still needs to be planned. Somewhere between the last folded towel and the start of lunch, there's a quieter, more mentally exhausting task waiting, figuring out what the family will eat for the next 7 days. This isn't a 5-minute job. It's closer to budgeting, logistics, and mild psychological warfare, all performed at the kitchen table with a pencil and a stack of cookbooks. The cookbooks themselves are a genre unto their own. Flip through any mainstream American cookbook or women's magazine recipe page from this decade, and you'll find an entire universe built around canned, condensed soup, gelatin, and a kind of confident, cheerful optimism about combining ingredients that, frankly, had no business being combined. Molded salads suspended in gelatin, sometimes featuring shredded carrots, sometimes olives, occasionally things best left undescribed, were treated not as a curiosity, but as a genuine sign of a hostess's creativity and modern sensibility. She flips through the pages with the same fragile optimism every week, hoping this time the plan will come together painlessly. Monday needs to involve meat. Tuesday, something with noodles. Wednesday, ideally some combination of the two, baked into a single dish heavy enough to double as a doorstop. Thursday is leftovers, quietly rebranded as something new. Friday is the fun night, a concept the children never seem to find quite as fun as advertised. Saturday, if she's feeling ambitious, a roast. Sunday, whatever dish will earn the loudest praise from her husband, ideally within earshot of a neighbor. Cross-referencing the week's ambitions against the actual grocery budget is its own quiet exercise in restraint. Something gets swapped. Something gets simplified. A recipe calling for a slightly exotic ingredient, paprika, say, treated in some circles of the era as borderline adventurous, gets quietly set aside in favor of something safer, blander, and far less likely to draw comment. A trip to the pantry closet reveals the household's ongoing inventory. Several cans of green beans that seem to multiply on their own, a couple of boxes of gelatin dessert mix, and a jar of pickles whose exact origin has been lost to time. She adds more green beans to the list with the weary resignation of someone accepting an unavoidable fact of domestic life. By the time the menu is finalized, tucked onto a small card and pinned to the front of the refrigerator, her pencil is dull, her patience is thinner, and she has developed an oddly specific fondness for a baked casserole recipe she's fairly sure no one in the house actually likes. But the week is planned. The casseroles have been decided, and for now that particular battle is over. Before she can even leave the house, there's the ritual of the coupons, clipped carefully from the newspaper the night before with a small pair of scissors, sorted into careful categories, and tucked into her purse with the seriousness of someone handling important documents. In an era before large discount retailers had reshaped American shopping habits, these small paper clippings represented real, meaningful savings, and using them correctly was treated as a mark of a careful, capable homemaker. The grocery list itself is written in pencil, because mistakes here cannot be permanent, and heading into a supermarket without a plan was, by the unspoken standards of the neighborhood, something close to reckless. She grabs a cart, one wheel squeaking with the enthusiasm of a small, distressed bird, and steers it into the store's long, orderly aisles. The produce section is the first proving ground. She squeezes a peach to check its readiness, inspects a head of lettuce for crispness, and places each item into the cart with the same careful deliberation a jeweler might apply to a fine stone, aware, on some level, that every other woman in the aisle is doing exactly the same thing and quietly judging everyone else's choices in return. The canned goods aisle is where the coupons finally earn their keep. She checks brand names against her clippings with real focus, matching each one carefully, aware that a mismatched coupon at the register is its own small, mildly humiliating failure. At the meat counter, the butcher, a cheerful man with forearms like ham hocks, wraps her order in brown paper, and she nods along with quiet confidence, even when she isn't entirely certain what cut she's actually purchasing. The middle aisles are the real danger zone. Marshmallows, novelty crackers, canned peaches on sale, small treats that serve no practical purpose beyond simple enjoyment. She lingers for a moment, tempted, then pushes the cart onward, because indulgence, plain, unnecessary indulgence, doesn't fit neatly into the week's careful budget or the era's broader cultural suspicion of anything resembling excess. At the checkout counter, she unloads everything with careful organization, grouping like items together, presenting herself, without ever saying a word, as competent and put together. The cashier checks each coupon against its expiration date with quiet suspicion, and every approved coupon feels like a small personal win. By the time she wheels the cart back to her car and loads the bags into the trunk, there's a genuine, if modest, sense of accomplishment. The particular satisfaction of having navigated a maze built from marketing, budget constraints, and a quiet undercurrent of social pressure, and come out the other side with everything she actually needed. By mid-afternoon, somewhere around 4:30, a quiet shift takes place in the house. The morning's labor has left its marks, a dress slightly wilted, hair beginning to lose its earlier shape, a face that has spent the day being pleasant, practical, and occasionally invisible. Now comes the task of undoing all visible evidence of that labor before her husband's car so much as turns onto the street. This is not vanity, or at least not only vanity. Popular magazines of the period were remarkably direct about the expectation that a wife greet her husband looking rested and composed, regardless of what her actual day had involved. The unspoken rule was simple. Whatever effort the house required, none of that effort should be visible on her face by 6 o'clock. She stands in front of the bathroom mirror and takes stock. Lipstick, worn away hours ago through a full day of talking, eating, and the occasional muttered word directed at an uncooperative appliance, gets reapplied with careful precision. Hair, slightly deflated after hours under a scarf or simply under the general pressure of gravity and humidity, gets brushed, repinned, and coaxed back into something resembling its earlier shape. A light dusting of powder smooths over the visible evidence of a long day's work. She checks her dress, straightens her apron, and makes sure the pearls are still sitting correctly against her collarbone. A small detail, but an important one, since in the visual shorthand of the era, pearls signaled composure even when composure was, honestly, running fairly thin by this hour. Around the house, she makes a few final adjustments. A cushion fluffed, a stack of magazines fanned out just so on the coffee table, a lamp switched on for warmth, and perhaps a small candle lit. Less for its scent and more for the general atmosphere of calm. It's meant to suggest a proof that whoever lives here has had a leisurely, well-ordered afternoon, rather than one spent wrestling a vacuum cord and a temperamental iron. As the clock creeps toward 5, she positions herself near the door, not so close as to seem eager, not so far as to seem indifferent. When the car finally pulls into the driveway and the door closes with its familiar, weary thud, she turns to greet him with the same warm, practiced smile she's been rehearsing since roughly 4:30. He sees a tidy house and a composed wife, and has no particular reason to imagine the hour of quiet, focused effort that produced exactly that impression. If breakfast was a rehearsal, dinner is the main performance, and by 1950s domestic standards, timing mattered almost as much as flavor. Dinner arriving even a few minutes early or late wasn't simply an inconvenience. It registered, in the quiet moral economy of the household, as a small failure of the entire day's planning. The countdown starts around 5:45. Pots simmer. The oven radiates heat into an already warm kitchen. She moves between burners with the focused urgency of someone timing several separate operations to land at the exact same moment. A roast resting, vegetables finishing, biscuits rising, all of it needing to reach the table within the same narrow window. As 6 o'clock approaches, the kitchen becomes genuinely chaotic, steam fogging the window over the sink, timers going off in overlapping succession, oven mitts occasionally brushing against something dangerously hot. She moves through it all with the controlled urgency of someone landing a plane on very little training, sliding dishes onto serving plates, and carrying them out to a table that has, of course, already been set with careful precision. The roast takes the center of the table, because in the visual hierarchy of a 1950s dinner spread, the main dish occupies the position of honor. Vegetables flank it on either side. Bread sits in a woven basket, positioned as though it's being photographed for a magazine spread rather than simply serving as dinner. She checks the clock one final time, 5:58, and sets the last dish down with a small, private sigh of relief exactly as the minute hand reaches 12. The family arrives at the table in their own time, drifting in with the casual unawareness of people who had no part in the 2-hour operation that produced this meal. Her husband offers a brief, appreciative comment, "Smells good," or something similarly modest, which, in the emotional economy of the era, functions as roughly the equivalent of a standing ovation. The children poke at their plates with the mild suspicion of young food critics evaluating something entirely new. Serving becomes its own quiet diplomacy, portions distributed, reactions monitored, small adjustments made based on who seems hesitant and who seems satisfied. She sits down last, and by the time she finally takes a bite of her own plate, the food has cooled considerably. A small, unspoken tax paid by whoever spends the meal managing everyone else's experience of it first. Still, no one else at the table seems to notice. They eat. They compliment. Some go back for seconds, and for one brief window, as forks clink softly against plates and the evening light comes in low through the kitchen window, the house feels steady, fed, and entirely, deceptively calm right up until it's time to clear the table and start the whole cycle over again. Nothing tests a 1950s housewife's nervous system quite like the sudden, unscheduled chime of a doorbell. In an era before telephone calls were treated as a strict prerequisite for visiting someone's home, neighbors dropping by unannounced was simply part of suburban life, and it meant a woman's home had to be presentable at literally any moment of the day, with no advance warning whatsoever. The doorbell rings, and she freezes mid-task, heart rate climbing slightly, because a doorbell in this context isn't just a greeting. It's an inspection notice. She has, by her own internal estimate, somewhere around 10 or 15 seconds before it rings again, and in that window, an entire silent emergency protocol kicks into gear. Toys get scooped up in a single motion and deposited into the nearest closet, which groans faintly under the sudden, unplanned addition. Newspapers, stray socks, and a half-finished school project vanish from the coffee table into a kitchen drawer. A child, sensing the shift in energy, asks what's happening and gets a quick, "Hush, just a moment, sweetheart," in response. She sprints, as much as one can sprint in a fitted day dress, to the living room, fluffing cushions and fanning out a few magazines with titles chosen specifically to project intelligence and modernity. She swipes a cloth quickly across the most visible surfaces. Silently hopping the afternoon sun doesn't decide to catch a stray streak of dust at exactly the wrong angle. The doorbell rings a second time. She takes one calming breath, ducks into the nearest mirror for a lightning fast assessment, hair slightly askew, lipstick partly worn off, general expression somewhere between composed and faintly haunted, and does what she can in the handful of seconds available. A quick pat of powder, a fresh coat of color on her lips, a check that her pearls are still sitting properly. Then and only then does she open the door, greeting her neighbor with a warm, unhurried smile that gives absolutely no indication of the small domestic emergency that preceded it. The neighbor steps inside without waiting to be invited. Social custom in this era treated hospitality as something simply assumed, not something offered, and settles onto the sofa to chat about her garden, her children, or whatever minor neighborhood development happens to be circulating that week. She offers coffee, listens attentively, and spends the entire visit quietly hoping her guest doesn't glance too closely at the suspiciously overstuffed hall closet. Eventually, the neighbor rises, offers a passing compliment about the curtain's high praise in the unspoken social currency of the block, and lets herself back out. The door closes. She exhales, rests her forehead briefly against the frame, and allows herself a full 10 seconds of stillness before turning back to whatever she was doing in the first place. Children in the 1950s were, by the standards of most parenting literature of the era, expected to spend a great deal of their day outdoors, largely unsupervised, returning home only for meals and the occasional scraped knee. In practice, this meant a housewife's afternoon often involved a kind of ongoing, low-level search and rescue operation, tracking the whereabouts and general well-being of several small, unpredictable individuals at once. One child heads for the backyard the moment breakfast ends. Another disappears into a pile of building blocks. A third, every household seems to have one, simply vanishes, resurfacing an hour later from some closet, crawl space, or gap behind the couch that no adult would have thought to check. There's an educational component to the afternoon too, at least in theory. She sits the children down with crayons and paper, hopping for a productive quarter hour of quiet creativity. In practice, this generally lasts less than a minute before a crayon snaps, another gets eaten, and a third finds its way onto the living room wall in what she chooses, generously, to interpret as an early sign of artistic talent. Outdoor play, meanwhile, tends to end predictably. The children locate the one patch of mud in the entire yard with what seems like genuine supernatural instinct, and return roughly an hour later looking less like children and more like small, cheerful swamp creatures. She watches from the kitchen window with the resigned understanding that this particular afternoon has just added significantly to tomorrow's laundry pile. Sibling disputes require their own careful diplomacy. A toy is contested. Feelings run high. She kneels between two small, indignant parties, mediating with more patience than she genuinely feels, offering to talk it out, while privately calculating how many more of these negotiations she'll need to run before dinner. Peace, once achieved, rarely lasts more than 20 minutes. There are questions, too, endless, relentless questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do worms go at night? What does Dad actually do at the office? She answers each one patiently, doing her best to balance honesty with the hope that the follow-up question doesn't veer into something genuinely difficult to explain. Household chores continue underneath all of this, punctuated by small interruptions, a shout of "Look, Mom," followed by something both impressive and mildly alarming, or a stack of freshly folded towels repurposed, within seconds, into the foundation of an ambitious pillow fort. Occasionally, a sudden and suspicious silence falls over the house, and she learns quickly that silence, in a home with small children, is never a good sign. She follows it to its source and finds some quiet, improvised catastrophe in progress. Flour on the kitchen floor, a tower of books stacked with genuine architectural ambition, or a trail of muddy footprints leading directly across her freshly cleaned carpet. And yet, in between the chaos, there are quieter moments too. A shared laugh over something small, two children working together on some lopsided but heartfelt project, a brief stretch of peace that makes the whole exhausting afternoon feel, if only for a moment, entirely worth it. Somewhere in the middle of the week, there's the Parent-Teacher Association meeting, an event technically framed as community involvement but functioning, in practice, as something closer to a quietly competitive social gathering. It takes place in the school gymnasium, a room that carries the faint, permanent smell of chalk dust and floor wax, with long folding tables set up along one wall to display an array of homemade baked goods, technically voluntary contributions, though skipping one entirely was, in most neighborhoods, simply not done. She takes her seat among the other mothers, each of them arranged with the same careful, composed posture, ankles crossed, hands folded, expressions calibrated somewhere between friendly and quietly evaluative. The PTA meeting, more than almost any other event of the week, operates as a kind of performance in politeness. Everyone pleasant, everyone supportive, and everyone, underneath it all, paying very close attention to everyone else. The meeting itself moves through updates, committee reports, and the occasional surprisingly heated debate about something like bake sale profits or the seating arrangement for the school choir recital. She nods along, taking careful notes on subjects that could probably be summarized in 2 sentences, aware that appearing engaged matters almost as much as the substance of the meeting itself. Then comes the volunteer sign-up sheet, circulated with the quiet ceremony of an official document. Timing here requires real strategy. Volunteer too quickly and you risk looking overeager. Wait too long and you might end up assigned to something considerably less appealing, coordinating the craft table, say, or organizing seating for an event nobody particularly wants to attend. She signs up for refreshments, modest, manageable, and unlikely to generate any real controversy. The social hierarchy of the room plays out quietly but unmistakably. One woman near the front, always immaculately dressed, seems to attract a small, steady orbit of admirers, her baked contribution somehow both effortless-looking and structurally flawless. Another woman further back endures a soft undercurrent of whispered concern about the consistency of her casserole, a critique delivered with just enough sympathy to seem, at first glance, entirely kind. Gossip moves through the room in a quiet, steady current, a passing comment about someone's husband coming home late, a remark about a neighbor's new haircut, a rumor about a fundraiser that may or may not actually be happening. She listens, nods, offers the occasional sympathetic sound, careful never to be the one who starts anything, only the one who lets it pass gently through. By the time the meeting adjourns, she files out with the other women, shoulders back, folder tucked under one arm, feeling as though she's just come through some low-stakes but genuinely exhausting social exercise. And in a month, she knows, she'll be right back in that same gymnasium, casserole dish in hand, ready to do it all again. If the PTA meeting is a mild social test, hosting an evening gathering at home is the full examination. Preparation begins days in advance, because entertaining guests in 1950s suburbia is treated less like a casual get-together and more like a small, carefully staged production. The house gets scrubbed from top to bottom, furniture rearranged more than once in search of a layout that somehow suggests effortless elegance, despite the very real effort required to achieve it. The menu takes real planning too, appetizers meant to look clever and slightly sophisticated, an approach that, in this era, frequently meant skewering cheese cubes and fruit onto toothpicks and arranging them into something resembling a small, edible sculpture. Deviled eggs get piped with careful precision. Cocktail sausages get arranged in a neat circular pattern that, in theory, suggests warmth and togetherness, though by this point in the day it mostly suggests sheer determination. Her husband, meanwhile, contributes by adjusting the record player and sampling more than his fair share of the cocktail olives, a division of labor that goes entirely unquestioned by either of them. By the time guests are due to arrive, she's dressed in her best outfit, pearls in place, the living room lit with a warm, deliberately soft glow. The doorbell rings, and guests arrive in the predictable social waves familiar to any host of the era, the early arrivals who require some awkward small talk to fill the gap, the punctual middle group, and the fashionably late stragglers who seem to treat timing as a personal statement. She moves through the room all evening, striking a careful balance between attentive and relaxed, cheerful but not exhausting, offering compliments that she genuinely hopes sound sincere. Conversation drifts between groups, the men gathered near the drink cart discussing cars, lawns, and the general state of the world, the women clustered near the food table offering each other careful, layered feedback on the evening's dishes. When a glass tips over or a small stain blooms across the rug, she's there almost instantly, armed with a cloth and a calm, practiced smile, resolving the minor crisis before it has time to become a real one. As the evening winds down and guests begin filtering out with warm, if occasionally hollow-sounding, thanks, she stands at the door waving until the last car disappears from the driveway. The moment the door finally closes, her posture softens. Her shoulders drop. The performance, for tonight at least, is over. Looking around at the scattered napkins and empty glasses left behind, there's a genuine, quiet satisfaction underneath the exhaustion. She hosted, she managed it, and the evening, by any outside measure, went beautifully. The moment her husband walks through the door in the evening, a small and very specific ritual begins. Post-war American culture had developed a genuine enthusiasm for home cocktail culture. The bar cart itself became something of a status symbol in many households, stocked with gin, whiskey, vermouth, and a small dish of nuts nobody ever seemed to actually eat. He arrives home carrying the accumulated weight of his workday, sighing with the particular drama of a man who has spent 8 hours in an office chair, and considers that, reasonably enough, its own kind of ordeal. She greets him warmly, asks about his day, and receives in return a fairly detailed account of traffic, a difficult phone call, and something involving a coworker whose name she's heard entirely too many times already. While he talks, she moves to the bar cart and begins assembling his drink with real, practiced precision. She knows, by now, exactly what a stressful day calls for versus an ordinary one, down to the specific garnish. Ice cubes clink into the glass. The shaker does its work. She hands it over with a small, genuine smile, and watches his shoulders visibly lower by half an inch the moment he takes the first sip. He settles onto the couch, tie loosened, shoes off, fully transitioning into the role of a man who has returned from honest labor. She moves quietly around the room, straightening a cushion here, picking up a stray toy there, only half listening now as his monologue shifts from office stress into general office gossip. In the back of her mind, an entirely separate tally is running. How many dishes are still waiting in the sink? How much laundry remains folded but not yet put away? Whether dinner needs another few minutes before it's ready. She nods at the right intervals, offers a sympathetic sound exactly when one seems called for, all while quietly managing an entire second set of responsibilities he has no particular reason to notice. Occasionally, he'll ask about her day, generally after finishing his own account in full. She offers a light, breezy summary. "Oh, nothing much." The usual, a phrase that, translated honestly, covers laundry, dusting, vacuuming, meal planning, a full afternoon of managing small children, and at least one minor appliance-related emergency. But the honest version rarely gets said aloud. The breezy version is simply easier, and in the social logic of the era, considerably more appropriate. By the time he sets his empty glass down with a contented sigh, cocktail hour has done its quiet work. She carries the glass to the sink, already anticipating the next round of dishes, and eases into the transition toward the evening ahead, familiar, practiced, and despite everything, something she's clearly mastered through sheer repetition. Politeness in this decade isn't simply good manners. It's closer to a full-time occupation, one she performs constantly, all day, with almost no visible effort at least, none that anyone else is meant to notice. It starts early. The mailman gets a friendly wave, calibrated carefully enough to seem warm without inviting an actual conversation. The garbage collector gets a similar nod, along with a private hope that he hasn't spotted the extra trash bags tucked discreetly behind the hedge. Even her own children, mid-tantrum or mid-question, receive the same practiced, patient smile, the one that suggests boundless calm regardless of what's actually happening underneath it. The real performance, though, happens outside the house. At the grocery store, an elderly shopper blocks the aisle for a solid 2 minutes debating between brands of canned soup, and she waits with visible patience, nodding along as though this were the single most interesting decision she's witnessed all week. On the sidewalk, a neighbor offers an unsolicited comment about the state of her flower beds, delivered in a tone just barely disguising genuine criticism as friendly concern. She smiles, thanks her for noticing, and files the comment away for later private irritation. At dinner parties, she absorbs outdated jokes and dubious opinions from various husbands and uncles with the same practiced, gentle laugh, small, appropriate, and giving away absolutely nothing about what she actually thinks. When someone offers unsolicited parenting advice, she responds with a warm "thank you, I'll consider that," regardless of how genuinely unhelpful the advice happens to be. When a neighbor remarks that she looks tired, Suburban shorthand, more or less, for "you look like you're struggling," she answers simply, "just busy," because admitting real exhaustion out loud would register, in the social rules of the era, as something close to a small scandal. She practices this expression, quite literally in the bathroom mirror sometimes, not too wide, not too stiff, calibrated to project warmth, competence, and absolutely no visible personal need of her own. Over time, this expression becomes almost automatic, a kind of emotional uniform she puts on each morning right alongside her dress and her pearls. Occasionally, in a private moment, the performance cracks slightly, a long breath through the nose, a brief pause before responding, a flicker of something honest crossing her face for half a second before she smooths it away again. These moments are quiet, private, and entirely her own. Then she straightens her posture, reapplies the pleasant tone, and steps back into the day, because in 1954, unwavering politeness isn't just a social nicety. It's armor worn daily, whether she feels like putting it on or not. Postwar advertising promised American housewives a revolution, gleaming new appliances that would supposedly transform housework into something light, modern, and almost effortless. In practice, a great many of these machines, genuinely new and remarkable as they were for the era, behaved less like helpful modern miracles and more like unpredictable, occasionally hostile members of the household. The vacuum cleaner is usually the first to test her patience each day. It roars to life with real enthusiasm, then, without warning, begins overheating, releasing a faint smell of warm rubber and vibrating with a kind of restless, mechanical unease. She learns over time exactly how long she can run it before it needs a brief rest, the same way you'd learn the moods of a slightly unpredictable pet. The washing machine is louder and considerably more dramatic. Built during an era when household safety standards were more of a general suggestion than a strict requirement, it bangs, shudders, and occasionally inches itself several inches away from its original position mid-cycle, as though genuinely attempting an escape. She's learned to redistribute the load carefully to minimize the worst of the shaking, though the machine, more often than not, simply finds new and creative ways to protest anyway. The oven has its own particular quirks, a door that won't seal shut unless lifted at a very specific angle and nudged firmly with a hip, a pilot light that flickers with what feels, on bad days, like genuine mockery. She's developed a whole private vocabulary of small negotiations with it, muttering quiet instructions to stay closed just long enough for the casserole to finish browning. The refrigerator, meanwhile, conducts its own slow, silent protest, running warmer than it should on some days, colder on others with absolutely no discernible pattern. She's tried rearranging the shelves more than once, hoping the machine might somehow take the hint. It never does, though it does occasionally emit a low, groaning hum that seems, at the very least, personally directed at her. And then there's the toaster, small, unassuming, and quietly the most dangerous appliance in the house. It burns toast at unpredictable moments, refuses to pop when it should, and has, on more than one occasion, launched a slice clean across the kitchen with what felt like genuine intent. She's learned to keep a healthy, respectful distance and a close eye on it at all times. Despite it all, she maintains her composure, the same practiced, unbothered smile she wears for everything else, even while standing beside a washing machine that sounds like it's actively trying to relocate itself. Over months of daily battle, she's come to understand each machine's particular quirks, how far to push the vacuum before it needs a break, the precise angle that keeps the oven door shut, which knobs on the stove lie outright about the actual temperature. The appliances may never fully cooperate, but she has, in her own quiet way, learned to work around every single one of them. In the American suburb of the mid-1950s, information travels through an entirely separate, informal network, one built not on wires or radio waves, but on porch conversations, grocery store aisles, and carefully worded remarks exchanged over the backyard fence. To live in this neighborhood is to participate, whether she likes it or not, in a constant, low-level exchange of small updates, subtle judgments, and quietly competitive comparisons. The day's reconnaissance often begins simply, retrieving the morning paper from the front step while casually taking stock of the block, whose curtains are open, whose lawn looks a little overgrown, who happens to be out early. Any small shift in the neighborhood's usual rhythm becomes, by mid-morning, potential material for conversation. At the grocery store, gossip drifts through the aisles like background music. Two women near the produce section trade a quiet comment about someone's husband arriving home unusually late. Near the bakery counter, a small group discusses a neighbor's new outfit with careful, understated scrutiny. She lingers near the citrus display, half listening, absorbing the day's updates the way anyone absorbs the news, whether they mean to or not. Much of this social evaluation runs on subtle, almost coded language. A woman's clothing choices might be quietly assessed as a reflection of her values. A homemade dish gets evaluated with the same seriousness as a job application. The unwritten scoring system covers everything from punctuality to hairstyle to how convincingly she can claim of an elaborate dish that took hours to prepare. "Oh, I just threw this together." Her own public image requires constant, careful maintenance. The house must stay presentable enough that an unannounced visitor won't be alarmed. Conversation must remain pleasant without accidentally revealing too much. Her cooking must strike the right balance between familiar and interesting, ambitious enough to seem thoughtful, but not so ambitious that it draws unwanted comment. At afternoon gatherings, coffee visits, sewing circles, school events, this entire social economy runs with quiet, practiced efficiency. She contributes carefully, offering a supportive remark here, a neutral observation there, never quite starting anything, simply letting information pass gently through her without adding fuel to it. There are real risks, of course. A single misstep, wearing something too casual to the mailbox, letting the hedges grow a little too long, sending a child to school with the wrong brand of pencil, can quietly become the week's topic of conversation. And yet, underneath all the careful evaluation and gentle judgment, there's a strange kind of comfort in it too. It's a shared rhythm, a collective performance everyone participates in together, bound less by real closeness than by a mutual, unspoken understanding of exactly how the whole system works. Underneath every physical task of the day, the cooking, the cleaning, the endless folding and refolding, there's a second, entirely invisible job running in parallel, one that no home economics textbook of the era ever formally acknowledged: managing everyone else's emotions. It begins before the house even fully wakes. She can sense, almost instinctively, what kind of day is ahead just from the particular quality of the silence upstairs, or the specific rhythm of her husband's footsteps on the staircase. Long before anyone says a word, she's already quietly calibrating, bracing for a difficult morning, or relaxing slightly into an easier one. When the children erupt into an argument over something as small as who got the bigger portion at breakfast, she steps in with the calm, practiced tone of someone negotiating a genuine dispute, kneeling down to their level, offering gentle words, working through a small conflict that, to them, feels enormous. She does this multiple times a day, every day with a level of patience that rarely gets acknowledged, let alone rewarded. Her husband, meanwhile, arrives at breakfast carrying the accumulated stress of his professional life, and she absorbs a fair share of that weight too, listening, nodding, offering warm reassurance, gently smoothing the edges of his day so he can head out the door feeling supported and capable. This kind of steady, quiet encouragement doesn't appear in any job description. It simply happens, continuously, in the background of everything else she does. Throughout the day, she functions almost like an emotional thermostat for the entire household. A cranky child gets a snack and a soft word. A tense, quiet house gets a change in her own tone or energy. Adjusted until something like equilibrium returns. None of this is formally recognized as work. It simply happens, constantly, threaded invisibly through every other task of the day. Her own feelings, meanwhile, tend to get set aside, filed away for later, which in practice often means never, or at least not until the children are finally asleep and the house has gone quiet. Even then, she allows herself only a small measured amount of genuine feeling, aware, on some level, that too much emotion all at once might make it harder to get up and do this all again tomorrow. Conflicts between family members become her responsibility to resolve, too. A disagreement between her husband and one of the children finds her stepping in as an informal translator, offering a gentle explanation to the child, a softened version of events to her husband, smoothing the emotional friction on both sides so it doesn't escalate any further. Extended family adds its own layer, polite letters, careful responses to her mother-in-law's occasional pointed comments, holiday correspondence, small apologies for things that were never really her fault to begin with. This invisible labor extends outward, too, beyond her own household. When a neighbor confides that her marriage feels distant lately, she listens for a full 20 minutes, offering comfort and perspective while quietly hopping her own dinner isn't burning on the stove behind her. She absorbs this concern the same way she absorbs everyone else's, quietly, patiently, filing it away alongside her own set-aside feelings, and offering whatever encouragement she can before sending her neighbor back out the door feeling just a little lighter. No one counts this work. No one thanks her for the quiet psychological labor she performs before most people have even had their coffee. And yet it continues, day after day, woven invisibly through every other task. The soft tone she uses to calm a tantrum, the encouraging words she offers her husband, the steady, even voice she maintains through every small crisis of the afternoon. It's the quiet, uncredited engine running underneath everything else the household appears from the outside to accomplish on its own. At night, once the house has finally gone still, she allows herself a brief moment to simply feel the accumulated weight of the day settling over her shoulders, if only for a few minutes before she gently sets it aside again, knowing she'll need the same steady reserve of patience again tomorrow and the day after that. Dinner is finished. The dishes are stacked. The children are, at least physically, tucked into their beds, and for one brief, fragile moment, she sits down, allowing herself to believe the day might actually be over. It isn't. There's a crumb on the counter, faint but unmistakable, and that's all it takes to set the evening reset in motion. She rises with the quiet resolve of someone returning to a task she's performed 1,000 times before and begins the last circuit of the night. The dining room comes first. The table still carries the visible aftermath of dinner, crumbs, a stray napkin, a small sticky patch of unknown origin that seems, against all logic, to be slightly larger than it was 5 minutes ago. She wipes it down in long, familiar strokes, straightens the chairs, and steps back to admire the room's brief, temporary calm, a calm she knows won't survive past tomorrow's breakfast. The kitchen, as always, is the real center of the evening's work. The sink has filled again, dishes multiplying with what feels like their own private momentum. She washes, rinses, and dries with the same steady rhythm she used earlier in the day, the repetitive motion oddly calming even this late in the evening. The stovetop gets its own attention too, grease splatters from dinner wiped away one by one. The counters and backsplash return to their earlier gleam. Next comes the living room, which has, over the course of the evening, drifted quietly into a state of mild disarray. pillows on the floor, a blanket half folded across the arm of the couch, a scattering of small toys left behind by the day's earlier chaos. She gathers everything methodically, folding blankets with careful precision, returning pillows to their proper place, scooping up toy cars and wooden blocks into a bin that promises far more organization than it ever actually delivers. A final walk through the hallway catches the last loose ends of the day: a stray sock, a picture frame nudged slightly crooked, a closet door that has somehow worked itself open again. She closes each one gently, switching off lights room by room until the house begins, slowly, to settle into stillness. Standing in the doorway at the very end of this circuit, she takes stock of her work: the kitchen clean, the floors clear, the furniture arranged with quiet purpose rather than scattered defeat. For a brief moment, the house resembles something close to what the magazines of the era liked to promise domestic life would look like. It's a small, quiet accomplishment, and for tonight at least, entirely hers. Before she allows herself to actually rest, there's one more short ritual left to complete: the quiet preparation of tomorrow, folded neatly into tonight. She checks each door, testing the locks with a light, familiar tug, because in the back of her mind, an unsecured latch is the kind of small detail that will absolutely keep her awake later, running through imagined worst-case scenarios at some unreasonable hour of the night. Once satisfied, she moves through the house, dimming lights one by one, each switch carrying its own small sense of closure. Kitchen light off, one task finished. Living room light off, another. Hallway light off, the day at last drawing to a close. In the closet, she lays out tomorrow's outfit with quiet care. A dress that reads as competent and put together without seeming overly formal. An apron chosen to coordinate without overshadowing. For her husband, a clean shirt and matching tie, set out not because he asked, but because mornings run considerably smoother when he isn't standing in front of his closet, half-dressed, silently trying to make a decision before his morning coffee has kicked in. She checks in briefly on the children, adjusting a blanket here, gently repositioning a stray toy there, watching each of them breathe for just a moment longer than strictly necessary. Despite the noise, the mess, and the general chaos of the day now behind her, this small, quiet moment softens something in her chest. A brief, genuine tenderness that makes the whole exhausting day feel, if only briefly, worthwhile. In the bathroom, she goes through her own final routine, washing her face, applying a light layer of cold cream, brushing her teeth with slow, unhurried strokes while studying her reflection in the mirror. This is the version of herself that exists only in this narrow window of the evening. Hair slightly undone, expression tired but steady, still recognizably the same woman underneath the day's performance. In the bedroom, she straightens the sheets, arranges the pillows, and finally climbs into bed, feeling the accumulated weight of the day settle gently around her. She pulls the covers up, closes her eyes, and allows herself, for a few precious hours, to simply stop, fully aware that morning, as always, will arrive considerably sooner than she'd like. By the mid-1950s, the refrigerator had become something considerably more meaningful than a simple food storage appliance. For a generation of American families still within recent memory of the icebox, a genuine feature of daily life for many households only a decade or so earlier, a well-stocked, well-organized refrigerator represented a small but real symbol of prosperity and post-war comfort. She opens it each evening with a kind of quiet reverence, arranging its contents with real deliberation. Milk goes toward the front, easily visible. Butter sits in its designated compartment, neat and squared away. Eggs are angled just so, curved side facing up, a small detail passed down through household advice columns of the era with surprising consistency, treated as though it carried genuine significance rather than being, in truth, a fairly minor point of preference. There are unspoken rules here, absorbed gradually over years of running a household. A refrigerator that looks sparse suggests financial strain or simple disorganization, so on leaner weeks, she rearranges what's available carefully, using a well-placed jar or two to suggest more abundance than might technically be present. Leftovers get transferred into tidy glass containers rather than left in their original, more obviously leftover form, because visible leftovers carried a faint whiff of social suspicion in an era that prized freshness and effort above convenience. Wilting produce gets checked daily and addressed quickly, because a limp head of lettuce or a browning apple registered, in the visual language of the period, as a small sign that things at home weren't being properly managed. She spends real time on this daily inventory, more time, by her own quiet estimation, than she spent choosing her wedding dress, though she's never actually said that thought out loud to anyone. The real test of this careful arrangement comes on the rare occasion a neighbor asks to borrow something from inside it. A quick, casual request, "Would you mind if I grabbed a bit of butter while I'm here?" sends a small jolt of quiet panic through her, because it means someone from outside the household is about to see the refrigerator's actual contents rather than its curated public reputation. She opens the door as narrowly as politeness allows, watching carefully as her neighbor reaches in, silently hopping. Nothing looks too sparse, too disorganized, or too obviously reheated. Once the neighbor leaves, she often reorganizes the entire shelf structure all over again, restoring everything to its proper visual order, even though realistically no one else will see it again until tomorrow. And yet, despite the mild absurdity of the whole ritual, there's something genuinely soothing about it too. The quiet, cool air, the careful rearranging of jars and containers, a small, contained task that, unlike almost everything else in her day, actually stays finished for more than a few hours at a time. On the rare night when the children are finally asleep, the dishes are done, and the house has genuinely gone still, she allows herself something increasingly uncommon in her daily routine, a moment that belongs to no one but her. She pours herself something warm tea, or perhaps a cup of cocoa, and settles into the one chair in the house the children haven't yet managed to colonize with crumbs or sticky fingerprints. The house, which just hours earlier felt like a small, constantly running factory, now sits hushed and heavy with the particular stillness that only arrives well after midnight. She wraps both hands around the warm mug and lets the heat seep slowly into her fingers. The cup is chipped slightly along one edge, a small imperfection she's grown oddly fond of, in a day otherwise built entirely around presenting a polished, seamless appearance to the outside world. Her mind drifts in a way it simply doesn't get to during daylight hours, not toward the next task, but backward, gently, over small, unremarkable moments from the day. A child's crooked smile at lunch, the particular quality of afternoon light across the kitchen floor, the small, satisfying sound of a perfectly folded towel landing on top of its stack. There's room, too, for the harder moments. A tantrum, a spilled drink, an argument mediated between two small, indignant parties, though these replay more softly now, without the sharp edges they carried in the moment. Outside, the neighborhood has gone quiet too. No lawnmowers, no passing conversations, no children's voices carrying across a yard. Just the hum of a streetlight and the occasional distant sound of a passing car. For a few minutes, the entire performance of the day, the smiles, the composure, the endless careful management of everyone else's needs, is allowed to simply rest. Eventually, the chair grows a little too comfortable, and she rises, stretching limbs that ache quietly from a full day's work. She rinses her cup, sets it in the sink for tomorrow, and moves quietly down the hallway, past her sleeping children, past tomorrow's outfit already laid out and waiting, and finally slips into bed beside her sleeping husband. For just a moment before sleep finally takes her, she feels, entirely and simply, like herself again. Once a week, usually on a fixed day set by the same rigid domestic schedule that governs laundry and ironing, comes floor day, a task substantial enough that home economics guides of the era treated it almost as its own separate discipline, distinct from ordinary daily tidying. She begins by clearing the room of furniture where possible, sweeping thoroughly first, because polish applied over crumbs and dust only locks the problem in rather than solving it. The broom moves in long, deliberate strokes, revealing the usual accumulation of small debris that seems to generate itself out of nowhere: bits of sand, stray thread, the occasional forgotten toy fragment that had, apparently, been living quietly under the couch for some time. Next comes the scrubbing, and this is where the real physical effort begins. A bucket of warm, soapy water, a rag, and a great deal of kneeling. She works in careful circular motions, section by section, her arms developing a dull ache well before she's covered even a quarter of the room. Her mind drifts during this part, the way it does during dishes, moving through half-formed thoughts about dinner, about the children, about whether the chicken in the icebox actually got properly defrosted this morning. Once the floor is rinsed clean, the genuinely demanding part arrives: waxing. Floor wax in this era carries a distinctive, sharp chemical smell, strong enough to make her eyes water slightly as she works it into the wood in careful, even layers, watching closely for streaks, because an uneven shine reads to the trained eye of a visiting neighbor as a small and very visible failure. The buffing that follows takes real patience. She works the cloth across each section repeatedly, until the wood begins to catch the light properly, reflecting the room back at her with a soft, glassy sheen. By the time she's finished, her knees ache, her back has registered its usual complaint, but the floor itself looks genuinely transformed, smooth, gleaming, briefly and improbably perfect. She straightens up slowly, admiring the finished room for a moment before the inevitable happens. A child wanders in, shoes still on, and she raises a single warning finger before a single footprint can be planted. The child pauses, considers the situation, and retreats. Small victory. The floor remains untouched, at least for the time being, and she allows herself a brief, genuine moment of pride before turning to whatever task waits next. The telephone occupies its own small pedestal table in the hallway, and it rules the household with a very particular kind of authority. Anytime it rings, dropping whatever she's doing to answer within the first few rings is treated, by the unspoken etiquette of the era, as simple good manners rather than optional courtesy. When it rings, she moves quickly, smoothing her apron, adjusting her voice before she even picks up the receiver, because her actual voice, tired, a little frayed by this point in the day, isn't the one meant for telephone conversations. What emerges instead is her phone voice, bright, pleasant, entirely composed, and giving absolutely no indication of the casserole currently at risk in the oven behind her. Callers tend to fall into a few familiar categories. There's the neighbor who calls simply to talk at length about something minor, a garden update, a recipe, a lengthy account of an errand that somehow took most of the morning. She listens patiently, murmuring small sounds of agreement, silently wondering whether it's physically possible to nap while standing upright. There's the caller delivering gossip, usually prefaced with some version of "now don't repeat this," a phrase that in practice seems to guarantee the exact opposite. She responds with carefully neutral exclamations. "Is that so? Well, I never," offering just enough reaction to seem engaged without contributing anything that might come back to her later. And then there's her husband, calling briefly from the office with some short, practical question. Did she remember the dry cleaning? Has dinner started yet? Each answered simply and pleasantly, even as something on the stove behind her demands genuine, immediate attention. Throughout every call, her tone stays consistently warm and unhurried, regardless of what's actually happening in the background. She might be packing the length of the phone cord, silently mouthing a complaint to no one in particular, but none of that ever makes it into her actual voice. Her real feelings, as with so much else in her day, stay carefully tucked well out of sight. Eventually, the call wraps up with some pleasant closing remark, and she hangs up the receiver, feeling her shoulders drop and her real voice return the moment the conversation ends. Then, without much pause, she turns back toward whatever crisis the casserole has quietly been building in her absence. It's worth pausing here in the quiet middle of the night to ask a genuinely reasonable question. Why did an entire generation of American women end up living inside a routine this demanding, this precisely scheduled, and this thoroughly performed? The answer isn't a single cause, but a convergence of several very real historical forces, all landing in the same decade at roughly the same time. The first is simple geography. After the Second World War, the United States experienced a massive wave of suburban construction, driven in large part by returning veterans, low-interest home loans made available through the GI Bill, and a booming post-war economy eager to build. Entire communities, Levittown on Long Island being perhaps the most famous early example, sprang up almost overnight, offering affordable single-family homes to young families in numbers the country had never seen before. This new suburban geography physically separated home from workplace in a way earlier generations, particularly those living on farms or in dense urban neighborhoods, had rarely experienced so completely. The husband commuted to an office or factory. The wife stayed behind in a house, often miles from extended family, from old neighbors, from the built-in support networks that had traditionally softened the load of domestic work. The second force was economic and industrial. Wartime manufacturing capacity, once devoted to tanks and aircraft, pivoted quickly toward consumer goods once peace arrived, and household appliances became one of the era's great growth industries. Washing machines, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and eventually televisions were marketed aggressively, often directly to women, with advertising that promised these machines would free up hours of a housewife's day for rest, hobbies, or leisure. In practice, historians of domestic technology have noted a curious pattern. Even as appliances objectively reduced the physical effort certain tasks required, the overall time American women spent on housework didn't drop nearly as much as the advertising promised, largely because standards of cleanliness, cooking complexity, and childcare simply rose to fill the time the machines were supposed to save. The third force was cultural and ideological. Women's magazines of the period, publications like Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and Good Housekeeping, reached enormous circulation numbers and consistently promoted a very specific vision of American womanhood: cheerful, domestically skilled, entirely fulfilled by home and family, with little room in the picture for ambitions outside the household. This wasn't simply reflecting existing attitudes. It was actively shaping them, presenting an idealized standard that real women were then expected to measure themselves against daily. There's also the simple matter of timing and generational memory. Many of the women living this routine in the mid-1950s had grown up through the Great Depression and lived through the Second World War, a period during which large numbers of American women had, in fact, worked outside the home, in factories, offices, and military-adjacent industries, often for the first time in their lives. The post-war cultural pushback toward the home was, in part, a deliberate effort to reopen those jobs for returning veterans, paired with a genuinely persuasive cultural narrative suggesting that a woman's truest, most important calling lay in homemaking rather than employment. All of this converged into the routine you've spent this evening walking through, not because any single person designed it that way, but because economic incentives, advertising, suburban geography, and cultural messaging all happened to point in exactly the same direction at exactly the same time. It's tempting, looking back from the comfort of hindsight, to see the 1950s housewife purely as a cheerful figure from an old advertisement, smiling, composed, perfectly at home in her kitchen. But even at the time, there were signs that the picture wasn't quite as complete as the magazine suggested. Later in the decade and into the early 1960s, researchers and writers began documenting a quiet, widespread sense of dissatisfaction among suburban housewives. Women who, by every external measure, were living exactly the life they'd been told to want, and yet reported a persistent, hard-to-articulate unhappiness underneath it. This eventually found its most famous expression in Betty Friedan's 1963 book, which described what she called the problem that has no name, a vague but genuine unease reported by countless American housewives who had done everything asked of them and still felt something was missing. That book and the broader conversation it helped launch arrived a few years after the exact day we've spent tonight exploring, but the discontent it documented had almost certainly been building quietly for years before it ever reached print. The woman in this story, composed, capable, endlessly polite, likely carried some version of that same unnamed feeling long before anyone gave it a name at all. And so the day ends the way it began, quietly in the dark, with the house finally still around her. Somewhere between the pre-dawn percolator and this late, hushed hour, she managed breakfast, laundry, dust, dishes, a full week's grocery list, a PTA meeting, an unannounced guest, several small emergencies involving children and appliances alike, and an evening of cocktails and dinner served at exactly 6 o'clock. None of it will appear in any record anywhere. No ledger exists to note that she did it, and did it again the day before, and will do it again tomorrow. It's easy, looking back from a considerable distance, to see this routine as simply strange. The pearls worn while scrubbing a stove, the vacuum lines treated as a kind of moral signal, the elaborate performance required just to greet a husband coming home from work. And it was strange in its way. But underneath the gelatin salads and the girdles and the carefully rehearsed smiles, there was real skill here, logistical, emotional, and physical, performed daily, by millions of women, almost entirely without acknowledgement. So tonight, as you settle into your own blankets, in a world with dishwashers and pre-washed lettuce and takeout delivered to the door, it might be worth a small, quiet thank you to the women who lived this exact routine, year after year, long before anyone thought to write any of it down. History doesn't always remember the people who simply kept things running, but they were there, all the same, folding towels at midnight, long after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep. Not every evening ends with cocktail hour and a quiet cup of cocoa. Some nights, once dinner is cleared and the children are settled, a different kind of work waits. The sewing basket, tucked in the corner of the living room, filled with a week's accumulated backlog of torn hems, missing buttons, and one particularly ambitious sock with a hole large enough to lose a finger in. Home sewing in this decade wasn't simply a hobby or an occasional necessity. It was, for many households, a genuine and meaningful contributor to the family budget. Store-bought clothing existed and was widely available, but a capable seamstress could produce a dress, a set of curtains, or a child's outfit for a fraction of the retail cost, using fabric bought on sale and a pattern clipped from a magazine or purchased for a few cents at the local shop. Sewing machines, increasingly electric by this point, rather than the older treadle-powered models, had become common enough fixtures in American homes that owning one, and knowing how to use it well, was considered a basic and expected domestic skill. She sets the sewing machine up on the kitchen table, threading the needle with the quick, practiced motion of someone who has done this hundreds of times before, and pulls the mending basket into her lap. The first item is always something simple, eased into the evening gently, a button, popped loose from her husband's shirt sometime during the week, reattached in a few quick, confident stitches. Next comes something more involved. A hem on one of the children's school outfits, let down slightly to accommodate a recent and entirely inconvenient growth spurt. She measures carefully, pins the fabric into place, and feeds it through the machine in a slow, steady line, the rhythmic hum of the motor becoming its own kind of quiet, familiar soundtrack to the evening. Darning socks is its own particular skill. One many women of the era learned from their own mothers. A small wooden mushroom-shaped tool slipped inside the sock to hold the fabric taut, while she weaves a careful patch of thread back and forth across the hole, closing it with a small, tidy repair, rather than simply discarding the sock outright. Waste, in this decade, still carried a certain quiet moral weight, a holdover from wartime rationing that hadn't entirely faded even a decade later. Occasionally, the evening sewing project is more ambitious, cutting a new dress from a pattern spread across the dining table, tracing carefully around the paper pieces with tailor's chalk, cutting the fabric with slow, deliberate scissors strokes. This kind of project takes several evenings to complete, worked on in patient stretches after the day's other responsibilities are finished. The half-finished garment folded carefully away each night and brought back out the next. Her husband, settled nearby with the newspaper, occasionally glances over and offers a mild, generally unhelpful opinion about fabric color, which she receives with the same practiced patience she applies to most of his other opinions throughout the day. The radio hums quietly in the background, a variety program, or perhaps a serial drama, providing a gentle undercurrent of sound as she works. By the time she finally sets the sewing basket aside for the night, there's a small, satisfying stack of completed repairs beside her: a mended sock, a let-down hem, a reattached button, small unglamorous fixes that will go entirely unnoticed by the rest of the family, and yet without which the household's clothing supply would slowly, quietly fall apart. She switches off the sewing machine light, tucks the basket back into its corner, and allows herself a brief, genuine moment of satisfaction, proof, however small, that something in this endless list of tasks actually stayed finished. By the mid-1950s, automobile ownership in the United States had climbed dramatically from pre-war levels, and for a great many suburban families, the family car had become something close to a small, cherished member of the household in its own right. With cheap gasoline, a rapidly expanding highway system, and a genuine post-war enthusiasm for leisure travel, the Sunday drive emerged as a beloved weekend ritual, a slow, purposeless loop through the countryside or nearby towns, undertaken for no particular reason beyond the simple pleasure of being in motion together. Preparing for the Sunday drive is, predictably, its own small production. She packs a light picnic basket the night before, sandwiches wrapped carefully in wax paper, a thermos of coffee for the adults, a bottle of something sweet for the children, and enough napkins to handle whatever mess 3 young passengers are likely to generate over the course of an afternoon. The morning of, everyone gets dressed with slightly more care than an ordinary Sunday would require. Even a leisurely drive with no particular destination is, in this era, still an occasion. She smooths her dress, checks that the children's outfits are presentable enough to survive a chance encounter with distant relatives or family friends along the way, and makes sure her husband's good driving jacket is free of any stray grease or garden dirt from the day before. The car itself, gleaming after a wash the previous afternoon, waits in the driveway like a small parade float. Her husband takes his customary place behind the wheel, adjusting the mirror with the quiet seriousness of a man about to pilot something considerably more important than a family sedan on a leisurely afternoon loop. She settles into the passenger seat, the picnic basket wedged carefully at her feet, and the children pile into the back with the barely contained energy of passengers who have, at best, 20 minutes of good behavior in them before restlessness sets in. The drive itself tends to follow a familiar, unhurried route out past the edge of the new subdivision, through a stretch of open countryside still visibly being converted, lot by lot, into the next wave of suburban development, and eventually towards some modest local landmark, a scenic overlook, a small lake, or simply a pleasant stretch of road worth admiring for its own sake. Radio plays softly from the dashboard, filling in the quieter stretches of the drive with music or a Sunday broadcast. Somewhere along the way, there's inevitably a stop, a roadside stand selling fresh produce, or a small general store where the children are allowed, after suitable negotiation, a single treat each. She manages the inevitable sibling disputes over who gets to choose first with the same practiced patience she applies to every other domestic negotiation of the week. Though out here, in the open air and unhurried pace of the drive, even the disputes feel somehow gentler than they do at home. The picnic, when it happens, unfolds on a blanket spread across some patch of grass. Sandwiches distributed, coffee poured from the thermos. The children finally released to run off some of their accumulated energy while the adults sit back for a rare, genuinely unhurried moment together. There's no clock to watch here, no dinner deadline looming, no doorbell that might ring at any second. Just a blanket, a thermos, and an afternoon with nowhere particular to be. By the time the car turns back toward home in the late afternoon, the children have usually worn themselves into a drowsy quiet in the back seat, and the drive back unfolds in comfortable silence, broken only by the low hum of the radio and the occasional passing car. She watches the new subdivisions roll by the window, half-built homes standing in various states of construction, evidence of just how quickly this entire suburban world around her is still being assembled, house by house, family by family. Back in the driveway, the ritual winds down the way it began. The children carried, half asleep, up to their rooms, the picnic basket emptied and rinsed, the car parked back in its usual spot for the week ahead. It's not a day off exactly, there's still dinner to think about, still a house to look after, but for a few unhurried hours, the week's usual demands felt, if only briefly, a little further away than usual. Church attendance in post-war America reached genuinely remarkable levels by the mid-1950s, with a large majority of the population identifying with some religious denomination and regular weekly attendance treated, in most suburban communities, as a basic expectation of respectable family life, rather than a private matter of individual conviction. For a housewife, Sunday morning wasn't a day of rest from performance. It was, if anything, a different stage entirely, with its own careful choreography. Preparation begins the night before, when the family's good clothes are laid out with the same precision applied to weekday work shirts. Her husband's good suit pressed and ready, the children's church clothes checked over for any stray stains or tears that might have gone unnoticed during the week. Sunday morning itself starts earlier than a day of rest probably should, since getting an entire family bathed, dressed, fed, and presentable enough for public inspection by 9 o'clock requires a schedule every bit as demanding as any weekday. She dresses with particular care, a modest, well-fitted dress, gloves, a hat chosen to coordinate rather than compete with everything else, because church attire in this era carried its own quiet social evaluation, not unlike the PTA meeting or the neighborhood coffee circuit. The children are inspected one final time in the front hallway, hair combed, shoes shined, collars straightened, before the family loads into the car for the short drive to the church itself. Inside, the pews fill with familiar faces, many of the same neighbors from the block, the same women from the PTA and the bridge club, all dressed in their own version of Sunday best, exchanging quiet nods and small pleasantries as everyone settles into their seats. Where a family sits, which pew, how close to the front, carries its own subtle social weight, an unspoken hierarchy that longtime members of the congregation understand instinctively, even if it's never actually discussed aloud. Through the service itself, she manages her children with practiced, quiet efficiency, a gentle hand on a restless shoulder, a small toy or picture book produced discreetly from her purse the moment fidgeting threatens to become disruptive, a stern but silent look reserved for anything more serious. Maintaining composed, well-behaved children through a full hour of service is its own quiet skill, one she's refined considerably since her eldest was small enough to require an entirely different set of tactics. The sermon itself often touches, at least in general terms, on themes of family, duty, and domestic virtue, messages that, whether intentionally or not, reinforce much of the same cultural expectation she's already absorbed from the magazines and the advice columns throughout the week. She listens attentively, nodding along at the appropriate moments, genuinely finding some real comfort in the familiar rhythm of the service, even as she recognizes, somewhere in the back of her mind, how closely its themes echo everything else already asked of her. After the service, the true social event begins on the church steps and the surrounding lawn, a lingering half hour or more of conversation among families in no particular hurry to leave. This is prime territory for the same quiet social evaluation that runs through the rest of the week. Whose children behaved best, whose hat looked sharpest, whose casserole contribution to the previous week's church supper earned the warmest reception. She moves through these conversations with the same careful, practiced pleasantness she applies everywhere else, offering compliments, receiving them graciously, and quietly nodding a few details worth remembering for next week. By the time the family finally piles back into the car and heads home, there's an unspoken sense of quiet accomplishment, not simply having attended service, but having successfully presented the household, for one more week, as exactly the kind of family the neighborhood expects it to be. Sunday dinner waits at home, and with it, an entirely different set of tasks. But for this one morning, at least, the performance took place somewhere other than her own kitchen. Family medicine in the mid-1950s looked considerably different from what most of us are used to today, and a housewife's role in managing it was substantial. She was, in practice, the household's primary health coordinator, tracking symptoms, scheduling appointments, and translating a doctor's brief, often clipped instructions into whatever the family actually needed to do at home. The occasion arrives on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, when her youngest wakes up with a slight fever and a complaint of a sore throat. She manages the first stage of this entirely on her own, a hand pressed to the forehead, a spoonful of something meant to soothe, a quiet, practiced assessment of whether this warrants a call to the doctor's office or simply a day of rest and closer watching. Home health guides of the era, distributed widely through women's magazines and pamphlets, encouraged exactly this kind of maternal triage, treating a mother's careful daily observation as the household's genuine first line of medical defense. When the fever doesn't break by afternoon, she makes the call. The family doctor in this era is, more often than not, a solo general practitioner known personally to the whole neighborhood, running his own small office rather than working within anything resembling the larger, more specialized medical systems that would emerge in later decades. House calls, while gradually becoming less common by the mid-1950s than they'd been a generation earlier, still happened often enough that a visit from the doctor himself, black bag in hand, wasn't considered especially unusual. She spends the time before his arrival or before the scheduled office visit, depending on the day, tidying the sick room with the same instinct that governs every other space in the house. Fresh sheets, a tidy nightstand evidence even here that this household runs smoothly, illness included. She keeps a careful, informal record in her head of symptoms, timing, and anything unusual, ready to report it clearly and efficiently the moment the doctor arrives, because a clear, organized account of a child's condition was, in this era's medical culture, considered an important part of a mother's responsibility. The examination itself unfolds with the doctor's quiet, practiced authority, a check of the throat, a listen to the chest, a few brief questions directed mostly at her rather than the child, since a mother's account of recent eating, sleeping, and general behavior was treated as considerably more reliable than anything a feverish 6-year-old might offer. Antibiotics, by this point in medical history, had become widely available and were increasingly prescribed for exactly this kind of common childhood illness. A genuine and relatively recent medical advance that a slightly older generation of mothers, raising children in the 1930s, simply hadn't had access to in the same way. She receives the doctor's instructions with careful attention, dosage, frequency, how long to expect the fever to run its course, and sees him out with the same practiced warmth she extends to every other visitor who crosses her threshold, despite the underlying worry she's been managing quietly all day. Once he's gone, the actual work begins. measuring out medicine at exact intervals, checking a small thermometer against the clock with real regularity, preparing a simple, easily digestible meal for a child with little appetite, and generally maintaining the sick room with the same attentive precision she applies to the rest of the household. Managing an ill child while still running the rest of the house doesn't pause anything else on the day's schedule. Dinner still needs to be prepared for the rest of the family. The other children still need supervision. Laundry, somehow, still needs doing. She simply layers this new responsibility on top of everything else already in motion, checking on her patient between other tasks, offering reassurance in the same warm, steady voice she uses everywhere else. Until, by evening, the fever finally begins to ease and a bit of color returns to a small, tired face. By the time she finally settles her patient in for the night, exhausted in an entirely different way than usual, there's a quiet, private relief beneath the exhaustion, the particular, specific comfort of having managed something that actually mattered, start to finish, entirely on her own capable judgment. Late summer brings its own particular marathon, one that stretches over several long days rather than fitting neatly into a single afternoon. Canning season, for many American housewives of this era, meant transforming a kitchen table into a small, temporary production line, working through crates of tomatoes, peaches, and green beans bought cheaply at their seasonal peak, and preserving them for the leaner months ahead. This practice carried real economic weight. Home canning had been actively promoted throughout the Depression and the war years as both a patriotic duty and a genuine household necessity, and even with grocery store shelves now considerably better stocked than they'd been a decade earlier. The habit persisted strongly into the 1950s, partly out of practical thrift, and partly because a well-stocked pantry shelf, lined with neat rows of home-canned jars, carried its own quiet symbolic weight, evidence of a household run with real care and foresight. The morning begins with an almost industrial level of preparation. Jars, lids, and rings get washed and sterilized in a large pot of boiling water, arranged in careful rows on clean towels spread across the counter. The kitchen fills with steam almost immediately, and stays that way for most of the day, turning an already warm late summer kitchen into something closer to a sauna. Tomatoes come first, usually, and the process is genuinely laborious, blanching each one briefly in boiling water to loosen the skins, then peeling, coring, and packing them carefully into jars with a practiced rhythm developed over years of repetition. Green beans require their own careful trimming and packing. Peaches need peeling, pitting, and slicing, the juice running down her wrists as she works through crate after crate with a patience that borders on the meditative. Once the jars are packed, they go into a large water bath canner, a deep pot fitted with a rack, deep enough to fully submerge the jars for the specific processing time each type of produce requires. This part of the process demands real attention to detail, since improperly processed jars carried a genuine risk of spoilage, a fact home economics literature of the era took seriously enough to publish detailed, carefully specific canning guides, complete with exact processing times for dozens of different fruits and vegetables. The kitchen, through all of this, becomes almost unbearably hot, windows fogged with steam, the smell of boiling tomatoes and sugar syrup filling every corner of the house. She works through it methodically, moving jars in and out of the boiling water with long tongs, listening carefully for the small, satisfying pop of each lid sealing properly as the jars cool on the counter afterward. A sound that, after enough repetition, becomes almost its own small reward, confirmation that the day's labor actually worked. By evening, the kitchen table holds rows of gleaming jars, tomatoes glowing deep red, peaches a soft amber gold, green beans a bright, preserved green, each one labeled carefully with the date and contents in her own careful handwriting. The pantry shelves fill gradually over the following days as batch after batch gets processed, until, by the time the season winds down, An entire wall of shelving stands stocked with enough preserved food to carry the family comfortably through the coming winter months. There's real, tangible satisfaction in this particular labor, distinct from almost everything else in her daily routine. Unlike a floor that gets dusty again within the hour, or dishes that pile up again by the next meal, a properly sealed jar of preserved tomatoes stays exactly as finished as it was the moment she set it on the shelf. A small, visible, lasting proof of a job done well, one that will still be sitting there, sealed and ready, months after the exhausting, steam-filled day that produced it has been entirely forgotten. Once every week or two, she carves out a rare pocket of the afternoon for something that is, technically, meant to be a small indulgence, though in practice it comes with its own set of quiet obligations attached. The neighborhood beauty parlor sits a short drive away, a small storefront with a row of hooded dryers along one wall and the low, constant hum of hairspray and conversation filling the air. By the mid-1950s, professional hairstyling had become an increasingly normal part of a suburban housewife's routine, supported by an expanding beauty industry eager to sell women on elaborate, carefully maintained styles that required regular upkeep to hold their shape. A set that looked effortless on Monday morning generally required a fresh appointment by the following week to maintain that same polished appearance, and skipping too many appointments in a row carried its own small, unspoken social cost. She arrives and settles into a chair, and the familiar routine begins, a wash, followed by careful sectioning and rolling into curlers, each one pinned into place with practiced speed by a stylist who has, by this point, been doing this same job on this same street for years and knows most of her regular clients' preferences by heart. Under the hooded dryer, the noise drowns out most conversation, leaving her with a rare, genuinely quiet stretch of time with nothing particular expected of her beyond simply sitting still. This, more than almost anything else in her week, functions as an actual break, not a performance of rest disguised as something else, but something closer to real rest itself. She flips through a magazine, only half reading it, letting the warm hum of the dryer and the low murmur of conversation around her wash over without requiring any particular response. Once out from under the dryer, the real social portion of the visit begins. The beauty parlor operates as its own small satellite outpost of the neighborhood gossip network, women trading updates between the click of curling irons and the snip of scissors. She catches up on the same familiar threads: a neighbor's upcoming visit from out-of-town relatives, a rumor about a house going up for sale 2 streets over, a brief, careful comment about someone's recent home renovation that seems to carry more judgment underneath it than the words alone suggest. The stylist works through the final combing and setting with practiced efficiency, shaping the curls into their finished form, spraying the whole arrangement into place with enough hairspray to survive a reasonably determined windstorm. She checks the final result in the mirror, turning her head slightly side to side, and feels for a brief, genuine moment, considerably more polished and put together than she has all week. The appointment wraps up with payment and a small, friendly exchange with the stylist, along with the standing agreement to return again in a week or two for the same routine. Walking back out to the car, hair set carefully enough that even a light breeze won't fully undo it, there's a small, real lift in her mood proof, in a strange way, that even inside a routine built almost entirely around caring for everyone else, there's still this one modest, recurring appointment reserved, if only briefly, for herself.